Urborg is a swampland of bogs and weed-choked waterways bordered by thick, green vegetation and plagued by insects. The ash-filled sky makes the sunlight dim and gray. Old ruins are buried under the vines and moss, some indication of the long history of this land. Some feature the heavy shapes of monolithic Thran structures, but most of the ruins have the spiky, organic look of Phyrexian remnants. In the mythic past, Urborg was the seat of Croesus, the primeval dragon of death. Legend has it that Urborg was once only the name of a city upon the isle. This hellish scene was controlled by the Lich Nevinurl, who was at war with Bogarden. Little is known of the war as it predates the Ice Age, but legend states that Nevinurl was outmaneuvered and the city of Urborg was swallowed by a volcano that tore up the ground directly beneath it. What doesn't grow dies, and what dies grows the Tarmogoyf.
Ermagerd, it's to Urborg Lhurgoyf! Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I am your host, Andy. I am here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, future philatelist Maddox.
Not by choice.
You have something in common with your father, which is that you like to collect little pieces of paper that are worth more money than they should be worth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In his case, it's stamps. In your case, magic cards.
Thank you for starting us out on a strong note of my father's demise.
Okay. I'm sorry about that. That's not really what I meant. Could you ever see your way to collecting something like a stamp that is just purely for collection's sake? I was thinking about this because I definitely like collecting magic cards. I definitely own cards I don't intend to play anywhere, but also I could never imagine myself collecting a thing with zero utility at all.
You just have it, and you just put it in the binder, and you close the binder, and it's like, done, we did the collecting.
It's like, I play Magic, so it's some future world where maybe I'll play one of these cards.
Art and other aesthetic objects that you...
I wouldn't call it collection.
Okay, interesting.
I accrue them. They stick to me like garbage to the big Katamari Damacy ball as I roll through life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is a big and very disparate topic we shouldn't go into too far, but I do really respect my father's collecting of stamps actually a lot, because he's a lover of history and of art and the way things are produced, and when he's
very intentional about it.
When I talk, or when I've met other stamp collectors, they're just like, yeah, I'm just checking off the boxes and trying to complete this task, and he's very much interested in the history and the what the stamp says about the human race and how it connects us to it. And it's this like little physical manifestation that connects you to all that history, which I think is very cool.
Wow, what's it like to admire your father? I would never know. Anthony, we can't get into daddy issues on this episode. It's because this is our Dominaria United Cube Community Set
Review. We'll save that
review.
for next week.
Yeah, that's next week's episode. And that means we are joined, of course, by the perennial guest for our Cube Community Set reviews, and that is Parker. The Domain Appreciator has entered the chat Lamascus.
That is me. Have you heard about how great Domain is?
You said in the Discord that you think that Territorial Kavu is your favorite card in my entire cube, and I was shocked.
I typed it from the heart. I didn't really stop to consider with my brain the truth of that statement, and then my brain caught up, and it turns out it is a true statement. Territorial Kavu is my favorite card in Bun Magic.
Well, I'm glad that your heart and your brain are so in tune with one another. I've been thinking about cutting that card. I don't know. I guess we get to discuss Domain maybe when we talk about these cards from Dominaria United. But
Andy,
before we do,
I know where you live. You cannot cut Territorial Kavu.
It is true. You do know where I live, so I gotta keep that in mind.
Does that mean you're just gonna show up at night and put it back in the cube every night?
Yes,
I'm at 361. How am I at 361? Weird. I'm not sure how that happened. We got to talk about all the results of our community survey, as well as the copious number of hot takes we got. I appreciate everybody stepping up to the plate to deliver on the hot takes. I'm really grateful for that. I think it adds a lot of texture and dimension to the episode to have other people's opinions in here as well. Parker, before we get into the actual results of the survey, you got to tell people how this thing works, like you always do, and you're so good at.
Thank you. I practice every morning in the shower. Our survey respondents provide us with 2 pieces of data. They give us the cards that they're testing, and then they rate those cards on a subjective scale from 1 to 3, whatever criteria they want, whether it's the art or the power level of the card or how appropriate it is for their environment. So this is not a measure of objective strength or objective quote-unquote cubability. It's just whatever criteria the designer chooses. And then I take them and, with the power of Python, analyze the data. And so that's what we'll be discussing today. Did I miss anything?
I don't think so. I guess you could cover the fact that this is a really popular set as far as cube designers are speaking.
Yes, that is true. For Dominaria United, we have broken, nay, shattered all of our previous records for survey engagement. We have 350 responses just for DMU. We also have more than 50 responses for the commander set that accompanies it. So that is huge. It is more than Modern Horizons 2. It is more than Innistrad Midnight Hunt. It is more than 10 times the number of people who responded to our very first survey, Throne of Eldraine. So this is a really big milestone. I'm really pumped about it. And I guess people are just really hyped for Dominaria United.
And a lot of that growth is really just us getting a little more popular, a little more visible, our audience growing in terms of the response numbers. But it's not just response numbers that this set is really popular. There's also just people testing a lot of individual cards.
That's true, Andy. In Dominaria United, the median designer who responded to us is testing 10 cards from the set and has given 2 cards of those 10 a rating above 2.5. That's a really strong rating that signifies that designer thinks 2 cards are going to stay really long-term for their cube. And that puts Dominaria United on roughly equal footing with sets like Kaldheim and Streets of New Capenna. Those aren't record-setting in terms of how many cards people tested, but they are definitely middle of the pack, above average.
It also just seems like, from looking at the results, there is kind of like just a linear progression of cards people are excited about. Oftentimes there's like a big steep drop-off when we look at the results where we can say, well, the top 8 cards are really popular, then it's kind of a big step down to the rest of the set. But as you go down this list, it's just like, a 1% jump every time, pretty much all the way down to the bottom almost. It's just people are excited for a wide variety of cards in this set, I assume, depending on the context of their cubes.
It's also funny looking at the results on the graph. So for every one of these surveys, we take all the results and we graph them with the average rating on one hand. So, the cards that are super highly rated up at the top and the cards that people are not as enthusiastic about at the bottom. And then the consensus, so how consistent those ratings are on the x-axis. And usually what we see is a little bit of a trend from the bottom left. So things that most people are not as excited about, but there's not as much consensus, up to the top right, where people are really excited about a card and everyone's confident about it. Here, everything's kind of just bundled in the middle, except for this weird couple other clusters and a couple outliers. So it's definitely an interesting set in that regard as well.
Yeah, it is true that not every combination of rating and consensus is possible. It's just the way the statistics work for this. So there's some envelope in the middle that forms the only possible responses.
I think we should talk about the top 5 cards for sure, but then otherwise I think it'd actually be more productive for us to kind of jump around to cards that maybe appeared somewhere in these results that we didn't expect, or, just put up some weird numbers that we can actually have something to talk about.
Sure, I can start with the card Founding the Third Path. Founding the Third Path was tested by only 14% of our respondents, but it is the most popular saga of Dominaria United, and so I wanted to mention it. Founding the Third Path costs 1 and a blue. It has the Read Ahead ability, which is choose a chapter and start with that many lore counters, add 1 lore counter after your draw step, skipped chapters don't trigger, sacrifice after the 3rd chapter. I can't believe I read all of that.
It's so
and
much
there's
words.
Still more. Chapter 1, you may cast this instant or sorcery spell with mana value 1 or 2 from your hand without paying its cost. Chapter 2, target player mills 4 cards. Chapter 3, exile target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard, copy it, you may cast the copy. I think Chapter 3 is the reason that 14% of our respondents have given this card a rating of 1.9. And it's because that last chapter has some echoes of Snapcaster Mage, in my opinion. And I think that's what is, drawing people to it and causing them to evaluate it highly. I do like that Chapter 2 really sets up Chapter 3. And I also like that Chapter 1 provides you a rebate on a spell and kind of cheapens the overall mana that you're paying as this card resolves. And I actually, I wasn't going to test it when I was reading through the responses and doing the analysis, but now I'm kind of curious about it. And if I open one in draft, I'm going to give it a try.
I am also curious about it. When this card was spoiled, I didn't know what to make of it, and I still don't really know what to make of it. The ceiling here seems really high. You mentioned that the first chapter can kind of give you a rebate on the mana you spent, but it can give you a 100% rebate on the mana you spent, right? You can essentially, on turn 2, if you were already going to cast an instant or sorcery, at sorcery speed, obviously, at a speed when you can actually cast this saga, then you just get to play the saga for free. It gets into play, you then cast your 2-mana removal spell or something, and you got to play the saga for essentially no mana.
Yeah, it's sort of like just having a regrowth with Suspend, too, in that case, that you paid 0 mana for.
Yeah, basically. And then the milling, I think, is relevant in a lot of environments. Also, it's worth noting that first chapter can fix your mana. I watched a couple Aspiring Spike videos, at least clips of Aspiring Spike videos, where he was trying this in Modern, specifically in a Reanimator deck, because you can cast Persist with that first chapter, and then milling is obviously relevant in the Reanimator decks. So, I don't know. This card, I think, does have a really high ceiling. The more I thought about it, the more I was like, how often am I on turn 2 in a game going to be casting a instant or sorcery at main phase speed? And I kind of came to the conclusion, not that often, especially in blue. A lot of my blue spells are stack interaction or similar. I think a lot of times maybe you'll get to get a free cantrip with this, but in that case, you're, in my environment, only getting back one of those 2 mana, which I think makes it a lot worse. I don't know. I was also thinking about a card like Mission Briefing, right? Because, I mean, the comparison to Snapcaster Mage, I think, is relevant, but Snapcaster Mage has just a really powerful card, a really high ceiling, and I was trying to compare it to a card that is similar, but maybe not quite as pushed, and Mission Briefing, I think, fits that definition. It also kind of acts as a Snapcaster Mage without a body. It also mills you a little bit, but you can play that one at instant speed, a little more intensive on the colors. It does take 2 blue pips. And that's not a card I see people playing a lot in their cubes. It's not one that made the cut in my own cube, so I'm not sure how this is going to land, but I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being a performer in some constructed format, and as a result, getting a little more attention from cube designers eventually.
Andy, I see it as primarily a blue-black or maybe blue-red card, where you're primarily casting removal on turn 2. In both of our formats, which are pretty fast, I think that's actually pretty reasonable, and it's often worth main phasing a removal spell because you're going to take 3 damage next turn regardless of whether you cast it during your opponent's main phase or during your own turn. And then I think Chapter 2, in addition to giving you card selection for Chapter 3, it's also a little bit of a dark ritual considering how much mill and escape and other graveyard as resource mechanics we both run. So I think the whole package is more appealing than it looked at first glance.
I mean, it does a lot for 2 mana. I mean, the dream, I think, is, you're playing some blue-black control deck, like you said, Parker. You play it on turn 2, you Doomblade your opponent's threat, then you mill a bunch of cards to fuel your eventual treasure cruise or whatever, then on the 3rd turn, you get to Doomblade something again. That's just a ton of value if you get to pull all those things off. And then, as a top deck, because it has read ahead, you don't have to, wait a super long time to get that value. If you just top deck this thing, you can play it right on Chapter 3 and just immediately regrow an instant or sorcery, essentially, and play it at that moment. So, yeah, I don't know. I think it's definitely got a lot going on. I'm still not going to be testing it until someone proves to me that this card is consistently doing that kind of stuff instead of being kind of clunky in most draws and sometimes having that high ceiling, because it is a lot of complexity cost and feels a little bit hard to navigate into a powerful game state to me.
I think it's kind of funny how sagas, I think, are just one of the most beloved card types of recent Magic, right? They're just, I've never seen anybody say a bad thing about them. At the same time, I feel like often in these surveys, they just don't come up that highly, and I wonder if it is because they're a little bit difficult to evaluate because they provide advantage over time, and also it's often a number of sort of disparate little things that add up to a full package that maybe that's just more difficult to evaluate, so when people are looking at a set initially, they're not as high on them.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I could see that being true.
Train Master GT's hot take. I think Archangel of Wrath is probably the greatest non-Phyrexian sleeper card in all of Dominaria United. This card basically combines all of the best parts of Siege Rhino, Flametongue Kavu, and Baneslayer Angel into one glorious package full of super modality. I like how it can go into Boros and Orzhov decks while retaining almost all of the functionality that it would have in a Mardu shell. I think this card looks great and more people should give it a look.
Next card I want to talk about is a card that we got 2 separate hot takes about, but is all the way down here at only 9.4% of our respondents testing it, and that is Leyline Binding. This is 5 and a white for an enchantment. It has Flash. It also has Domain. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each basic land type among lands you control. And when Leyline Binding enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent, blah, blah, blah. It's Oblivion Ring, instant speed, with the cost dependent on the different number of basic land types you have in play, and the potential ceiling of this being a single white mana for an instant speed Oblivion Ring, which is obviously a very, very high ceiling. This card, I think, is making some waves in Constructed. I see people talking about this a lot as maybe the most exciting card in this whole set for Modern. And, certainly with things like Triomes and, very greedy mana bases, this can get very, very powerful. High rating. Only 9.4% testing it, but a rating of 2.2, which is quite high for a card that far down the testing list.
Crionicity's hot take.
My hot take is Leyline Binding. And the reason why I think this is actually a sleeper pick is because if you're playing a 2-color deck, then it's going to reduce its cost to 3 and a white, which is a little overpriced. But if you're running fetches or duels, you'll have incidental color and basic land types among lands. And this can even get as low as a 1-cost card, which is kind of wild. I'm personally running Triomes and Duels and Fetches, so for me, this is a no-brainer.
Parker, I know you have a lot of mana fixing, a lot of it with basic land types. What do you think about Leyline Binding? Are you playing this in your own cube?
I definitely am. I don't have my hands on one yet, but I plan to play it, and I think it will be quite strong. I expect it to cost 2 or 1 mana most of the time that it's played. And that's partly because I support all 10 Triomes and a lot of fetch lands, and so it's trivially easy to kind of unlock those additional colors. But that's a decision I really like enabling in my environment. Not only because it makes your mana more consistent, but actually it's like a separate decision tree where you can evaluate, is it worth playing this 1 or 2 color outside of my mana base Triome? Maybe I should use an example. Let's say I'm in a Naya deck and I want to put Leyline Binding in my deck. I might be willing to play a blue Triome or a black Triome in order to make it cheaper. That compromises the consistency of my aggressive Naya mana base. And so that's a crunchy kind of risk-reward decision that I really enjoy. And I think Leyline Binding will contribute to those decisions.
This card is in some ways a lot more explosive than perhaps some cards people have been comparing it to. I've seen people talk about comparing this to Prismatic Ending, which on the surface kind of makes sense. Like Prismatic Ending is another removal spell that gets better the more different colors of mana you have in your deck, right? But the thing about Leyline Binding is that, if you play a tapped Triome on turn 1 and the second turn you fetch up a dual land that is the other 2 colors, this is a 1 mana O-Ring on turn 2, right? This can very quickly be extremely efficient and get to like the peak of its power level, whereas you're not going to be able to have the 5 mana to dump into Prismatic Ending on turn 2 ever, because you need to actual spend the mana. It's not just a matter of counting those basic land types. So yeah, I think this card's really good, and for those that are on a lot of Triumph support, those that do like having the 3 or 4 color decks show up in their environment a lot, this seems like a really good payoff for those sorts of decks to me.
And I want to add that even though this is only 10% of our respondents, because we have just so many respondents this time around, that's still like 30 people. It's as many people as ever responded to our Eldraine survey.
Okay, you keep rubbing that in, Parker. Binding. Everyone has to start somewhere, okay?
Hey, I'm just trying to give some context. Yeah, I mean, this goes really deep, this whole list of responses, and Leyline Binding is just one example of that. It's found a niche audience, and they're excited about it.
Train Master GT's hot take.
Leyline Binding is pretty cool. In formats with lots of typed lands, this card has the potential to be one of the strongest removal spells. However, it does require a little bit of setup, which means that its power has to be something that's a little bit worked for. I think this is a nice dynamic that a lot of designers and drafters alike will enjoy.
I found looking through, especially the comments left in the survey, that people found Domain pretty polarizing, or I should say, Domain is pretty polarizing among the people that are playing cubes, designing cubes. A lot of people were just saying, Domain is not for me. It's not something I'm putting in my cube at all. And some people thought it was fantastic, and they really like this sort of interaction you're describing of building your mana base to try and support it. So that's another quirk about the way that we're collecting this data, is the people that are rating it are also self-selecting as being interested in it already. So the cards that are going to receive low average ratings are going to be things that are sort of appealing. Maybe they're flexible, but there's some reason they're not quite as exciting to people. Whereas this being this card that only makes sense in certain contexts is still going to be highly rated because it's only going to be it's more clear what context is going to fit in, right? I think one other card that's not one of the top cards, but is really interesting in the way that it stands out, is Meria, Scholar of Antiquity. This is 3 mana for 3/3, a legendary creature, Elf Artificer. It has tap an untapped non-token artifact creature you control to add green, and tap 2 untapped non-token artifacts you control, exile a top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So this has kind of been compared to Urza, but in green-red, which is kind of a wild card.
Really high rating for a relatively low number of testers, too. So the people that want this card really want it. I'm imagining those are basically cube designers that have artifact-themed environments or really, really deep artifact archetypes.
Right, so it's one of the... It's not very high in terms of number of testers, only 3% of the people that responded, but 2.6 rating, which is really high. I think it's maybe the second card just to a couple others. Yeah, I mean, it just does something very novel. I think it has an extremely high ceiling, and something that you don't necessarily see in this color pair a lot. So I think that, yeah, like you're saying, there are a lot of cube designs that have these kind of niche interests that maybe this is going to be a great payoff for.
I'm having a hard time just imagining what these cube environments might look like or what the kind of deck looks like that really wants Meria. I mean, the fact that you have to tap a non-token artifact both to get the mana and also to, play the cards off the top of your library. I'm wondering what the non-token artifacts in these decks are that aren't like creatures that you'd rather be attacking and blocking with, so you're probably not going to want to tap, sorcery speed, or artifacts that already have activated abilities on their own, like your Retrofitter Foundries or whatever, that you also probably aren't going to want to tap to this because they have so much more valuable abilities stapled to them already. So I guess this is a card that fits in environments that I'm not totally familiar with, and I'd love to see what those decks look like sometime.
I could definitely see it fitting in a lot of Commander and multiplayer cubes, as well as things that are specifically just leaning into artifacts in general. Maybe even like combo-y environments. Maybe you have your Pili Pila and things like that. But we do publish the full data set, so we can actually go look at the specific decks. I mean, the specific cubes that people are including this in. I'd be curious.
Joe's hot take.
Karn Living Legacy is active garbage. That said, if you want to make him more playable in your cube, you should definitely be running a full set of signets instead of talismans, as they will allow you to filter the mana from his power stones into something actually useful. If you manage to make a cube where Karn is playable, I am very interested. Basically, any planeswalker will win 3 turns after he comes down, and Karn is no exception.
A card that jumped out to me is one we talked about last week, Anthony, and this is a Tail Swipe. This is that instant speed, fight spell, and improved Prey Upon. It just makes 2 creatures fight, and if you cast it during your main phase, the creature you control gets +1/+1 till end of turn. This is tested by 15% of our respondents with a rating of 2.1. I don't think it's hard to say this is the most popular green removal spell we've ever seen tested, and it's more people than I expected to see playing this card. So maybe they finally printed a fight spell that has a decent number of cube curators excited about it.
Yeah, I mean, the uncommon green fight spell is not something we usually see high on these reviews at all.
I even would have maybe thought that Bite Down, was that the name of the one that just punches? I think it's called Bite Down. I even would have maybe thought that would have been higher. Yeah, that's all the way down here at only 3.7% of our testers, and that one can make your creature punch a creature or planeswalker for 1 more mana, still instant speed. I'm not even convinced Tail Swipe is better than that. I mean, I'm a huge hoe for mana efficiency, but I don't know. It's very interesting to me to see that card this high, and I'm curious to see if some of these curators are playing, power maxed or very powerful cubes and have finally found the fight spell that fits in that environment for them. Probably an all-star in peasant cubes, I imagine, too.
Yeah, that's something else that I think really stood out about this set, is a lot of people specifically called out that this set offered a lot to pauper and peasant designs.
Italian Andy's hot take.
Hello, Andy and Anthony. I'm also Andy, a listener from Italy. And thank you so much for the content you're producing. I'm a big fan. It's my favorite thing to do on my drive work. I prefer you even over good music, so that's something. I wanted to mention Llanowar Loamspeaker. It's a card I dearly love already. I included it in many of my cubes, and I think it's just a great cube card overall. It's a mana dork that provides you the mana you need in the earlier turns, and afterwards it attacks always for free. Lands get more expandable as the game progresses, and I think it's honestly one of the best designed mana dorks of all time. I really love it, and I was surprised that you didn't mention it. So my hot take, Llanowar Loamspeaker is the greatest and maybe one of the coolest mana dorks of all time.
Another card which I think does appeal to Pauper and Peasant respondents, as well as maybe some higher power environments, is Tear Asunder. Tear Asunder is 1 and a green for an instant. It has Kicker for 1 and a black. And its text reads, exile target artifact or enchantment. If it was kicked, exile target non-land permanent instead. It's tested by 19% of our respondents with an average rating of 2.2. So this is kind of a split card between a naturalize effect that exiles and a 4-mana Vindicate. However, I really, really love the incentive structure of Tear Asunder, and I'd even go so far as to say it might be my favorite design, just from a pure design perspective, of the entire set. And the reason is, Tear Asunder always costs green and sometimes costs black. That is in contrast to other styles of gold cards. I mean, we have Assassin's Trophy, which always costs green-black, and we have a card like Deathrite Shaman, which sometimes costs green and sometimes costs black, or like it's an either or. Tear Asunder is always green, which means it can be a sideboard card in green decks. It can be a main deck card in environments that do care about the artifacts that much. But if it's main decked or if it's sideboarded in those green decks, they're going to be incentivized to find that black splash because it does unlock some serious power. So they're going to bring in their off-color Triumph. They're going to bring in their off-color Fetch. They're going to bring in their Treasure Makers. And that's a way of producing kind of some free organic synergy in an environment in a way that doesn't have a big externality. It doesn't have a big cost. If you don't find the black mana, you still have a perfectly playable sideboard card. Or, in some cases, a main deckable hate card. And I really love the way that kind of the floor is brought up by this design, but the ceiling is still there, and it still invites a lot of really fun, synergistic recontextualizations of the rest of the environment.
Yeah, I think everything you said basically applies to all of the kicker cards in this set, and Tear Asunder is the most popular kicker card we see amongst our respondents. The next highest one is, I think, all the way down there with Rona's Vortex, unless I'm missing one of them. I understand the appeal for this card. I will say, for my part, I have found the disenchant with upside or disenchant modal card to be not as relevant as I might have first thought in my cube. Maybe it's just because I have cut down on artifacts over the years and never really had that many enchantments, and so that effect is truly a sideboard effect. You really never want to be main decking a card like that in my own personal environment. But I guess all these cards come along with the disenchant with side effects. I'm thinking of the Wilts, the one you can cycle, the Nature's Chant, one people are excited about. That's either green or white. It's that hybrid card. There's also the one that also can kill a creature with flying. I forget what that one's called. Broken Wings, maybe. There's a couple of these disenchant cards that have this upside, and they all are pretty uninspiring to me. And this one I think is kind of similar, right? It's, I think, a sideboard card, perfectly reasonable. 4 mana for Vindicate, not fabulous. And if I were to put this card in my own cube, I would expect that would be the main mode. There would be rare enough that you'd want to exile an artifact or enchantment that you're basically playing a 4 mana Vindicate. But that obviously depends on the environment you're in.
Yeah, I should say it's not the right fit for my main cube, but I'm so excited to draft the regular cube and splash the black part of Tear Asunder off of a bounce land or something. And I'm so excited that I'm contemplating, what is another cube I can build that Terra Asunder will be perfect for?
That's how you know it's a good card, when it makes you want to build a whole new cube. And I have that feeling sometimes too, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, I feel like I'm getting pushed to putting this card in my cube. It is really interesting to think about how both the floor and ceiling of these cards is really relevant. What you think of as the main mode of these cards is really relevant. And how much that changes depending on the context is really relevant. I was thinking about this in the context of my own cube and thinking, well, really, it's just the kicker cost that you're mostly looking for. I'm usually going to be putting this in a deck because I want that, and it's going to be sort of basically a green-black card. But actually, in a lot of more, faster, maybe higher-powered environments, a 4-mana Vindicate might just not be that powerful, so it actually might be more of just a disenchant with this extra text. So these cards are really difficult and interesting to evaluate in different contexts, I think.
I guess weirdly, the card that I am thinking about when I look at Terra Asunder is Baleful Mastery. That's the removal spell from, whatever set it was, where it has a 2-mana mode that can remove a thing, creature or planeswalker, but lets your opponent draw a card, or for 4 mana, you can just remove it straight up. And I was excited about that card initially because I was like, well, this is potentially very efficient if you need efficiency, right? Like if you are the aggressor and you want to get rid of a thing and kill your opponent before they can take advantage of that card they've drawn, then it has that really efficient mode. And if you're the control deck, then, maybe 4 mana is actually fine because you're going to go to the long game anyway. I found that card just really clunky and didn't play well in my own environment. The 2-mana mode was the mode you most wanted to cast, and the downside was too real. And at 4 mana, it was just a bad card. And so it's one of those cases where the modality did not make up for the rate on either side of the effect. And I think in my environment, Terra Asunder would be the same. But as I said, that will definitely depend on the specific context whether or not these sides are worth the modality.
Cryonicity's hot take.
My next hot take is I want to talk about the 2 Selesnya cards, King Darien, the 48th, and Ajani Sleeper Agent. King Darien's definitely far leagues above what Selesnya already has to offer. It's a good value creature, and it provides some great protection. Value with the sense that it's going to put some tokens down and make more tokens and counters, and it's going to buff everything else. And then you can sack it to protect all your tokens. So if you have a token theme, this is a very good one. And then Selesnya Planeswalkers are very lacking, and I try and run a Planeswalker in every 2 color type. So Ajani Sleeper Agent seems like the most interesting one that we've gotten in a long, long time.
I want to talk about one more saga from this set, and that's the Elder Dragon War. This is 2 red for a saga with read ahead. I'm not going to read that whole block of text again. Parker already did that for us. The first chapter, the Elder Dragon War, deals 2 damage to each creature and each opponent. Chapter 2, discard any number of cards, then draw that many cards. And Chapter 3, create a 4/4 dragon creature token with flying. I think this card is really powerful. It's really interesting that, I think the 4 mana slot, especially in red, is just kind of rife with options from Magic's history of powerful cards that do a lot of stuff. And so this has a stiff competition to make it in some people's cubes, but the combination of a board wipe-esque effect, it's not going to hit big creatures, obviously, but it's going to clean up any of the small stuff that's still around. Some amount of rummaging, being able to refill your hand with whatever you need, and then getting a very on-rate card. A 4 mana 4/4 flyer is a perfectly reasonable stat line in almost any environment, depending on what other upsides it comes with. I think this card's really potent, and I expect this maybe to be more popular as time goes on, because at the time of recording, we only have 11% of our respondents testing this card with an average rating of 2. So that's a card that just jumped out to me as I think a very powerful option at 4 mana in red, if you're into that kind of thing.
I wish I could skip only Chapter 2.
just do the damage and get the creature immediately?
Yeah.
It's funny, I feel like that's a similar Chapter 2 to what we see on Fable of the Mirror Breaker. I have felt that to actually be more relevant than I initially expected. I feel like there's often times where you are happy to just cycle 1 card to up your delirium count, or give you 1 more card you can delve away with a Murktide Region or a Treasure Cruise or whatever. So I wonder if that's the kind of thing where you'd never really want to pay a card for that effect, but perhaps stapled onto another card that already has value on the other ends, value bookending it. It might actually be more relevant sometimes than you might expect.
Yeah, casting Fable of the Mirror Break in some different contexts, you're playing it really for the creature, both the creatures you get out of it. But I've always found that, yeah, it's like, oh, do you want to do some rummaging? Yeah, I've got some extra lands here. I've got some spells that aren't quite going to be relevant at this point in the game. It just always turns out to be relevant.
Also, the art here, if people haven't taken a close look at it, is actually wood burned into a large chunk of tree and then photographed for the card, which is in the long history of sagas having this beautiful kind of real craftsman art that is then applied to the cards. So take a closer look at that if you haven't already.
All right, next I'd like to talk about Baird, Argivian Recruiter. This is red-white for a legendary human soldier. At the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power greater than its base power, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. It's a 2/2. It's being tested by 8% of our respondents with an average rating of 1.9, but I think it is a little bit underrated, much like our hot take submitter.
Joe's hot take.
Baird Argivian Recruiter, or however you say that dumb name, is probably the coolest Boros card we've gotten in the last 2 years or so since Winota. It pays you off for equipment, it pays you off for anthems, it pays you off for +1/+1 counters. How? By being a better version of Bitter Blossom. Boros as a color combination has always suffered from the fact that red aggro and white aggro on their own are usually stronger. However, I believe Baird allows people to attack the board in a unique angle and provides a scaling power threat in a variety of cubes that will let you commit to getting your opponent dead without overcommitting the board. If you want to try and get your drafters to play Boros for the first time in a long time, I recommend trying out Baird.
The card is so cool. I mean, this rules text, the fact that it works with equipment, it works with combat tricks, it works with +1/+1 counters, like, it's just such an elegant way to care about so many different things in Magic's history that I think it's such a cool design.
Yes, and that makes it so much more modular than any prior Boros legend that I'm aware of, and even like the vast majority of Boros creatures in Magic's history. I did do a Scryfall search to confirm this. Most Boros legends care about equipment or attacking in a very like narrow way, and Baird is so much more open-ended and for that reason much more synergistic.
Yeah, so I think it's just such an elegant way to in an abstract way refer to a lot of things that do end up mattering in the Boros color pair. I didn't even mention auras. Auras also fall in this category. And obviously, it's designed to work with Enlist, so if Enlist is also a thing that would work with this thing. So, yeah, I don't know. This card is just so cool, and I definitely could see it working in a lot of different environments, and it's potentially very powerful. I mean, 2-mana 2/2 is a card you'll play in your deck that wants to beat down, especially with the upside of potentially making a token every single turn.
Yes, I think a good comparison here is Clarion Spirit, where the card has potential to get value before your opponent has a full turn to interact. Baird, however, is multicolored, and that comes with some risks to the mana base, but getting an additional body, to me, means that it's worth playing even on turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, especially if you're double spelling. That gives you more time to set up the trigger as well. So I think Baird, even on turn 5, it brings with it a human soldier maybe, and can be double spelled with, a 3-drop. I think that floor is okay, and the ceiling is you follow Champion of the Parish up with Baird, or you follow up a Curd Ape with Baird, and have played a green dual land, and you're immediately getting 3 creatures on turn 2.
Right, Curd Ape. I didn't even think about that. Static abilities that affect their base power.
So
and
I'm
toughness.
playing it.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a ton of
to
creatures, that whenever you cast a spell, you gets +1/+1, or other just ways to trigger pumping a creature, and this works with all those
Planeswalker
cards.
abilities that buff power and toughness. I mean, there's so many things that are going to count towards this, and it's going to be really hard to just write a Scryfall filter that searches your cube for all those cards. You're going to have to do the manual work of actually looking through yourself. Anthony's eyes just lit up a little bit. He's trying to figure out if he can abstract this into some sort of query we can post in the show notes.
Scryfall is also a very, very powerful... It's run by some powerful people, and they often already do pre-create those searches for things that have an obvious sort of type of thing you're looking for, and we'll include them right on the page. For this one, it's not there yet, but it might be a little bit too broad to actually write.
I think it's pretty complicated to figure out all the cards that could potentially proc Baird.
Train Master GT's hot take.
Urborg Lhurgoyf is one of the weirdest cards in Dominaria United, but it's also probably my favorite. It's rare that an inexpensive payoff card can also be one of the best enablers for a certain archetype. Urborg Lhurgoyf is capable of dumping 6 whole cards into the graveyard, while also having a potentially large body. If drawn late, it can just be cast for 2 mana, allowing for easy double spelling when the milling is not sensible. This card looks like an absolute riot for Sultai midrange, and I'm excited to play it.
I want to draw attention to one more hot take we got that I thought was pretty interesting. Machine Schooling pointed out that Sheoldred was their favorite card from the set.
Machine Schooling's hot take.
When I evaluate a card for Cube, I consider 3 main things: the diversity of archetypes that would play the card, how interested the archetypes are in playing that card over other cards, and how the card recontextualizes other cards in the draft. That's why the card I'm most excited for in Dominaria United is Sheoldred the Apocalypse. Sheoldred is a reasonably powerful creature that's solid in aggressive decks since it provides unblockable damage, but also in controlling decks as it provides a massive blocker and life gain. However, the main reason it excites me is that it totally recontextualizes wheel effect and life payment. Sheoldred is perfect as both a stabilizer and combo piece in a wheel deck, making cards like Memory Jar much higher picks. It also offsets the life payment in black midrange decks, making cards like Dark Confidant much less punishing.
Sheoldred the Apocalypse is 2 black for a legendary creature, Phyrexian Praetor. It's a 4/5 with Death Touch, and whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life, and whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. I want to call attention to this because I saw this card and I was immediately just like, okay, this is just like a black good stuff creature, right? Like the stats are good, the abilities are good, like there's nothing wrong with this card, but my initial reaction was that it didn't really have any interesting draft or build around considerations. It was just like a good creature with good abilities stapled to it. Some of the things that Machine Schooling mentioned in their hot take are very relevant. Like if you have an environment where you have a lot of wheel effects or something, all of a sudden this can just like one-shot your opponent in combination with a Wheel of Fortune or something, which I had not really thought about. It's also a pretty steep punish to a deck that's like a Xerox deck that's playing a lot of cantrips to try and find their answers. If they have to draw 3 cards to find their removal spell for Sheoldred, they're taking 6. I mean, that's a really substantial hit. So these lines of text that I think I originally interpreted as like just very kind of boring, I think are actually quite dynamic, more dynamic than I originally thought.
Yeah, I mean, it really makes Brainstorm look very challenging.
Oh, buddy. Jeez. Yeah, you untap.
Hope you have your 1 blue mana up when your opponent casts this.
Yeah, you untap, draw for turn, still don't find your removal spell. Do you Brainstorm and lose a total of 8 to try and find your Doomblade for Sheoldred? You can't Doomblade Sheoldred. You know what I mean?
Yep.
The Royal Doomblade, the abstract Doomblade. Yeah, so I don't know. This card I think is maybe better than I first gave it credit for, and I think definitely more interesting and dynamic in terms of deck building and gameplay than I first gave it credit for.
It is seeing a little bit of Pioneer play already, which I find interesting. Partly it's to hose opposing treasure cruises, like you mentioned, but then it's also just like such a huge stat line. It can block Bone Crusher Giant, for example, is an enormous creature, but Sheoldred just shrugs it off. And then the life gain is also really helpful against aggro of all flavors. And so I'm like a little drawn in by that. And then also it's just so cool. It's like the whole package is really cool looking, and it's really tempting to be able to put a Phyrexian Praetor in my low curving cube and not have it laughed out of the room.
Yeah, I mean, for everything we just said about punishing your opponent's brainstorms and treasure cruises, equally rewards your own brainstorms and treasure cruises. I mean, if you get to untap this thing and cast your brainstorm and you've gained 10 life off your Sheoldred already, that's going to make it really difficult for any aggressive opponent to ever come back from that. And honestly, that life gain will keep me personally from ever touching this card with the 10-foot pole, even if most of the time it's just going to get removed before your next draw step. I'm too afraid of somebody brainstorming into treasure cruising and somebody's combat deck having no answer for that.
Do they have an answer for a 4/5 though? I mean, were they ever winning?
Yeah, I mean, you could remove a 4/5.
You should curve Sheoldred into Uro and then gain some life.
Oh, buddy. See, that's the thing, is like even Uro, so much harder to gain 8 life with Uro than Sheoldred. It's going to be, I don't know, I think this card is just swingier than I first thought it was. Honestly, my first impression was like, it's kind of underwhelming for a Phyrexian Praetor, and the more I actually think about how this card's going to play, I think it is actually quite splashy and potent.
Joe's hot take.
With the addition of the Raven Man, I believe black discard is a powerful thing that you can run as an archetype in any cube. Between the Raven Man and Turok, we have much better payoffs than do-nothing enchantments like Waste Not. Turok and the Raven Man also both provide discard enablers themselves, either in the kicked or activated abilities. When you play Powered Cube with lots of combos, the only way to keep decks consistently balanced is to include large amounts of blue counterspells and black hand attack. While Wizards hasn't printed much good hand attack recently, Pilfer seems to be one that is almost on par. When you are running a high enough density of hand attack, payoffs like the Ravenman or Turok, or even Tarmogoyf, allow you to end the game after stopping or slowing down your combo or control opponent. I would highly recommend that most cubes, especially powered cubes, run more discard, and when you are running more discard, the Ravenman and Turok both become good playable threats.
All right, shall we jump to our top 6?
All right, so our number 6 card in terms of just the raw number of people that are testing it, so not necessarily how high the rating is, but how many people are interested in this card for their cube, is Squee, Dubious Monarch. This is 2 and a red for a 2/2 legendary creature, Goblin Noble. It has haste. Whenever Squee, Dubious Monarch attacks, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking. You may cast Squee, Dubious Monarch from your graveyard by paying 3 and a red, and exiling 4 other cards from your graveyard rather than paying its mana cost. This is being tested by 30%, so almost a third of the people that respond to the survey, and it has a pretty high average rating of 2.2 out of 3.
We talk about cards that have some precedent, some card you can compare it to that is a somewhat known quantity, and people are, I think, rightfully comparing this to all the various Goblin and Rabblemaster variants we have gotten over the years. Though I think it's more different from Rabblemaster than, say, a Legion War Boss or a Krenko Tin Street Kingpin is, in that it does have haste. It's going to start attacking immediately. The, upfront damage output of a Squee is much higher until you get a couple turns in, right? If you can actually afford to attack with your Goblin Rabblemaster and none of those tokens get removed, then Rabblemaster outpaces it pretty quick, but that's rarely the case. And so if you're just looking for immediate punch, this is the most explosive Rabblemaster we've ever seen. Plus, it's unique in having that recursion ability. We've never seen a quote-unquote Rabblemaster that can bring itself back with a... it's literally escape, just without the keyword escape written on Squee here.
So yeah, I'm not surprised that it's being tested by so many people. It often is things that are somewhat known quantities that are variations on similar cards that end up near the top here, and this being sort of a variation on multiple known quantities, the sort of Squee archetype of this little goblin that keeps coming back from the dead or is immortal in some way, is also just very nostalgic and compelling. And the comparison to Goblin Rabblemaster, I think you could even compare it to just, cheap threats with haste that come in and start doing stuff. That is a big feature of a lot of red decks in cubes, so it makes sense to see this up here so highly.
Phoenix of Ash is another good comparison. I also feel obligated to mention that one of our survey respondents, Papa Zedrew, responded and gave a comment in their survey that was only Squee in all capitals, and that really was
People
a pleasure
love
to
Squee.
read.
Squee's a very lovable character.
I know, and this art is charming, and so
charming.
It's just great.
Talking about the guy sitting on top of a big pile of skulls.
Well, maybe you're looking at the stained glass art. I think that one is very charming, actually.
Oh, I'm looking at the pile of skulls. Actually.
Okay, never mind.
He's just so nonplussed on that throne. It's great, and I'm not sure
there's
whether
a pile of skulls in both cases.
Yeah, is Squee dubious about his monarchy, or is it dubious that he is a monarch? I'm unsure.
I read it as the latter, but
okay.
I don't read any of the stories, so I don't know.
Dubious choice for a monarch.
Let's put away all of our mealy-mouthed, design-focused language. Let's have a nuts and bolts conversation about power level here. How do you all think, in as close to a vacuum as you can imagine, Squee Dubious Monarch is going to compare on power level to the exact card Goblin Rabblemaster?
You've stumped us.
Not all at once. I think it's a tough question to answer. So it's first worth noting that the clock over 2 turns, if you can actually attack with all of your tokens and your creatures, and they all don't get removed. The Goblin Rabblemaster, right, it's 1 on turn 1, and then on turn 2 you attack for 4 with the Rabblemaster plus 2 tokens, so it's a total of 6, 7. 7 over 2 turns. Squee is 3 on the first turn and 4 on the second turn. So over 2 turns, they are the same, and then Rabblemaster pretty quickly outpaces Squee on an empty board against no removal in terms of actual damage output. I feel like the fact that Squee has to attack to accrue value is a significant cost, where, you might say that Goblin Rabblemaster in play that has to just throw goblins into combat that don't presumably don't have good attacks, if the Rabble Master itself doesn't have good attacks, is also not generating any value. But there are ways to, care about creatures dying or sacrifice creatures to things that I feel like come up a non-zero number of times that are not going to be able to be triggered with Squee. But the thing that's going to matter more often, I think, is honestly just having that engine, being able to throw an extra 1/1 into combat every single turn with the Goblin Rabble Master is going to make your other attacks better, right? Like, let's say you've got a couple other creatures in play that you're attacking with. Your opponent might have a 2/2. They might have a good block on your Goblin token, so you might think you're just kind of throwing it to the wolves. But that card either tying up that blocker every single turn, or maybe not tying up that blocker because your opponent is forced to block one of your other more valuable creatures, means that you do get a lot of value off of just spitting these 1/1s out every single turn, where if you had to attack with the Rabble Master, that card would just trade in combat immediately and you would lose your engine. I did have Squee in my pre-release pool, though, and I gotta say, I think this has got to be the best Goblin Rabble Master on defense we've seen, just purely because of that escape ability. This thing can come back any number of times, doesn't enter the battlefield tapped, it can just keep blocking for 4 mana and a couple cards from your graveyard every turn if you need to do that, which will come up. So I think it's like more flexible than your average Rabble Master, than the actual card Goblin Rabble Master. Has a lower ceiling in that Rabble Master will just kill your opponent outright in like 3 turns most of the time, and this will need a little more time to do that. But if you only get 1 turn with your 3-drop before it gets removed, as is the case in a lot of powerful cubes, then this is going to get in for more damage and also represent that possible recursion ability. So I don't know. I didn't put this on my testing list for my cube. I don't know. I just felt like it's so similar to Rabble Master, but Rabble Master has this kind of iconicness to it for me. And it must be said, if I'm looking at all of my red 3s, Goblin Rabble Master is the one I'm currently least enthusiastic about for my own cube. So I would not consider adding another. The question is do I swap this one out for Squee if I want to? And at first I was like, no, I could see maybe doing it for the reasons I mentioned, but I think it's really hard to make the call on a power level perspective. I'm going to say, no, it's not as good as Goblin Rabble Master, whose primary job is being a fast clock on an empty board.
I don't know. I see that fail case as being kind of similar, though. If your opponent has blockers and you're forced to attack with your other Goblin tokens, you're losing your Goblin tokens. And same with Squee. If you don't have good attackers, you're not making tokens. So it's kind of just similar in that case. And so I feel like it's going to be a little bit contextual on environment, obviously, but I think that ceiling of just having this whole extra thing that Squee can do of just coming back from the graveyard and generating extra value is going to be a pretty big game in a lot of contexts.
If you put me under duress and force me to choose one, I think I'm on Squee being stronger. Not in a vacuum, of course. I mean, the math just proves that Rabble Master is more damage, but in my format at least, there's always a 2-powered blocker. And in that case, I'm actually more interested in the recursion because Squee will be able to keep punching long after Rabble Master is in your graveyard. But then again, I gotta say, I just don't care. At this point, we have 5 Rabble Master variants. We have at least 5 red 3-drops that are proactive at a similar power level to Rabble Master that do very different things. I'm thinking of Bone Crusher Giant. I'm thinking of Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Lelia, Phoenix of Ash.
Seasoned Pyromancer.
I mean, there's Brea's Apprentice if you want to go down the archetype route and do artifact things. So, I'm at the point where it's just choose your favorite play pattern. And if you want some graveyard interaction in red, then, hey, now you have Squee. And if all you care about is, for example, sacrifice fodder, then maybe you want Rabble Master's token every turn guaranteed.
I do think it definitely comes down to whatever your taste is. The difference here in power level is going to be pretty negligible either way. I think it's kind of a toss-up and will depend a lot on context. You said something interesting there, Parker, which is that the decks in your cube always have a 2-power blocker, which raises the question, are either of these cards any good in your cube? Is Rabble Master any good? Is Squee any good if you can always expect your opponent to have a card to block it on the battlefield? And I would argue probably not. If that's the case, if your environment is so dense with those kinds of creatures, then maybe you should be looking at a Phoenix of Ash that can attack in the air. It has evasion. Maybe you should be looking at a Lelia, which can grow out of blockable range relatively quickly. I think that's kind of the case for me. I think that's why Rabble Master is the card I'm least enthusiastic about in that slot in my cube right now, just because a lot of decks are going to have a card that can block it profitably, and so its ceiling of bashing your opponent's face in 3 turns is really hard to come by.
You're absolutely right, Andy. And I mean, I was a little hyperbolic. It's not always literally a blocker, but if not a blocker, then it's maybe a Disfigure or maybe a Doomblade or a Planeswalker or whatever. There is a lot of interaction in my list. And I do play Lelia and Phoenix of Ash and not Goblin Rabblemaster right now. Yeah, that's just where I'm at. It's contextually not as powerful as it might be in other cubes.
The last thing I want to mention, just because we talked about every other angle of this card, is that this card is going to be, I think, significantly less good in constructed context than a card like Goblin Rabblemaster, purely by virtue of the fact that it's a legend. So you're not going to see people, I think, slotting this into, for example, like Legacy prison decks, because it's a legend. You can't get two of them in play, whereas if you do your turn 1 Chalice of the Void off of Ancient Tomb and your turn 2 Rabblemaster, you can do a turn 3 Rabblemaster, and then your opponent gets dead real fast. And as we know, constructed strongly informs cube evaluation as well, so I think people might be a little low on this card because it won't be popping up in constructed anytime soon, I don't think.
That's a great point. It's still a good fun of in Legacy Goblins.
Oh, I think it might see play in a Goblin Tribal deck, maybe.
Yeah,
but
you gotta have room for fun ofs.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, you know, that specific like red prison deck in Legacy is built on the assumption that your opponent will not have anything in play, right? That's why Goblin Rabblemaster is so good there, because the whole point is to lock your opponent out of doing anything and kill them as fast as possible so they don't have any time to get out from under the lock. And that's exactly what Rabblemaster does. This much fairer in some sense, and, you know, much better in some sort of combat mirror or like a grindy game, but that's not what that deck's trying to do. It's trying to just lock you out and kill you as fast as possible.
Joe's hot take.
Squee Dubious Monarch is the best Rabblemaster printed in the last 6 years. While it's not quite as quick of an aggressive clock as Rabblemaster itself, unlike Lelia, Nagila, or any of the other ones since, it has recursive value, which means that it's a better late-game engine. It's very similar in my mind to a red Planeswalker, but with a much more aggressive tend. He doesn't even need a keyword for his powerful ability, which is always a bonus when you're curating a cube with this many unique, complicated effects.
Our next card in the number 5 slot for popularity of Dominaria United, it's Guardian of New Benalia, thus proving Andy extremely wrong from last week. The Guardian is 1 and a white for a 2/2 human soldier. It has Enlist. It has whenever Guardian of New Benalia enlists a creature, scry 2. And it has discard a card. Guardian of New Benalia gains indestructible until end of turn, tap it. It is tested by a third of our respondents with a rank of 2.1 on average. It is the second coming of that in Hallowblade, whatever its name is.
A card that Parker clearly
Hallowblade
loves. Anthony and I talked about this card somewhat at length in the last episode, so Parker, I want to hand it over to you. What do you think of Guardian of New Benalia?
Oh boy. I'm not sure I have too many thoughts. In my
Head
format,
empty,
it's going to
no
be
thoughts.
attacking into a Watch Wolf a lot of the time, and that's definitely a downside, so I won't be testing it. That said, I think the incentives more broadly and in a design sense are pretty neat. It's nice to be able to make your game pieces relevant in the late game, and that's what Enlist does. It also makes, you know, any extra lands in your hand relevant even into the late game by discarding them. And it provides value that is somewhat orthogonal to the aggro game plan of killing your opponent as quickly as possible. I really like aggro tools which give that orthogonal value because it means the aggro player can have game and stay in the game for longer, and it kind of decreases the non-games that can characterize linear aggro game patterns.
Is this actually bad in the face of Watch Wolves, you think?
I don't know. Maybe it's not. Maybe that's just my rationale for ignoring it, but...
Well, because the reason I ask is because I think this card is not good unless you are enlisting something onto it, right? If you're not doing that, it's just a 2-mana 2/2 that you can discard a card to make it destructible, which I think is...
Which, I mean, that's a card in a lot of contexts.
In some contexts, yeah. I think in the context where we're comparing it to Season Hallowblade or something, it's a lot less exciting. So in the case you are enlisting something onto it, you don't need to be a Watch Wolf to threaten to trade with this thing in combat. You could just be any old 2-mana, 2-power creature that can threaten to kill it in combat.
Yeah.
And the fact that this, in a deck with Watch Wolves, now all of a sudden you're attacking with a 5/2 that can be indestructible, I think that's going to be a relevant clock.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially where this might not shine as much is if there's a lot of tokens or small creatures in the environment where you maybe don't want to discard a card to essentially turn that into a removal spell for a 1 or 2 power or whatever random creature.
It's got to be a 2-power token to do that, though. Otherwise, it's just chumping either way.
True, yeah. But in the case where most of the creatures are on board are bigger creatures, discarding a card to turn it into a free 5 damage to something, that's much more relevant. So I could actually see this performing better in those kinds of contexts.
You're right. I'm eating my words from minutes ago. I do think it would be strong in my format. And this reminds me that the reason I'm not testing it is actually much simpler. It's just because I didn't want to introduce the enlist rules text into my format.
Totally fair.
I find the summoning sickness line to be a real, like, it's the worst part of enlist, if you ask me.
That's definitely the rain on your parade that can't be a summoning sick.
And I don't know. I would even take, like, if we just rebalance the numbers to let it be, the same strength as far as a supercomputer is concerned, and if it were to read more elegantly, I would much prefer that version. But Who knows? I mean, I could be convinced if this sees a lot of standard play or pioneer play, then that means my drafters will be exposed to the rules text and it won't come as a surprise to them. And in that case, I'm a lot friendlier towards this card just in terms of its, overhead logistically.
Something else that's interesting about this card is quite a few people pointed out in their comments of the survey that they're specifically interested in this as just a white discard outlet, just as a way to be able to get cards in the graveyard in white, which is interesting that this is doing a lot of different things for different people.
If that's the case, might I recommend that Hallowblade?
That one's much cleaner for sure. This has got a lot more text on it than Season Hallowblade does. I gotta say, as the weeks go on, and it's only been a few weeks so far, I just get more and more excited about this card the more I think about it. It started as me thinking, it's probably not as good as Season Hallowblade. Do I really want to add another card that's like similar but more complicated? To now where I feel like I think this is like a significant amount better than a Season Hallowblade in any kind of board stall, which is the situation where maybe a card like that is most potent. I find myself pressed with the question of how many of these white 2-drops that can be indestructible do I want to run? I've already gotten some grumbles in the past of opponents that were, playing some removal heavy deck and were like, my opponent just played cards that I couldn't destroy, and it was like felt like my removal spells didn't matter. It doesn't happen often, but I have gotten that complaint, and so I don't think I would just drop this in alongside a Danto Vanguard and Dauntless Bodyguard and Season Hallowblade. I would probably swap one of those out for it, maybe, but we will see.
You're also on Mother of Runes and Giver of Runes, right?
Yeah, I like those ones.
Okay, yeah. That might be another part of the problem. Do you think you could alleviate that by tuning the removal of the format? I know you're on Disfigure, which gets around Indestructible. I wonder if there are other spells kind of in that vein that could just be kind of lateral swaps that improve the matchup against white aggro like that.
Well, funnily enough, the paradox of the cube designer, I have also gotten the complaint. I drafted a Danto Vanguard in Season Hallowblade, and my opponent had nothing but Disfigures and Deadweights. These cards don't do anything. And so it's like, all right, well,
yeah,
a lot of things can be true, and sometimes the cards don't break in your favor, and that doesn't mean the environment is necessarily flawed.
And I know for your goals, you're actively trying to punish, in some ways, the person who's drafting nothing but removal and control pieces. Or at least you don't want that to be a defining characteristic of the games. Like all my stuff got destroyed every turn for the entire game and I got to do nothing. Usually that's a bad guy that is okay to punish a little bit.
I gotta think about whether or not that's actually something I want to punish. I definitely don't want stally games, and I guess that is kind of a way to define a stally game, but if that's your whole game plan and you're also like taking up a planeswalker or something, I feel like I'm more okay with that. I gotta think about that. While I'm thinking about that, let's move on to our number 4 most popular card from Dominaria United. It's Evolved Sleeper. This is 1 black mana for a creature, human. It's a 1/1 and it has pay a black. Evolved Sleeper becomes a human cleric with base power and toughness 2/2. It has 1 and a black. If Evolved Sleeper is a cleric, put a Death Touch counter on it, and it becomes a Phyrexian human cleric with base power and toughness 3/3. And it has 1 black. If Evolved Sleeper is a Phyrexian, put a +1/+1 counter on it, then you draw a card and lose 1 life. That last ability, important to note, you can activate as many times as you like. I've already seen people on Twitter saying that they have watched their opponents not activate their Evolved Sleeper multiple times when it would have benefited them, so do not forget, you can just keep putting counters on this thing and drawing cards if you get to a state where that is advantageous.
In fact, you can activate any of these abilities as many times as you want.
Okay, buddy. This is being tested by 38% of our respondents with an average rating of 2.2. Much like Squee and Guardian of New Benalia, this card does have some precedent in your Figures of Destinies, your Students of Warfares, your Wardens of the First Trees, cards that people perhaps have played in their environments and have some expectations around how they perform. And I'm still excited about this card, and it seems like most of our respondents are as well.
Well, not most, 38% of them.
Okay, fair. It seems like a lot of our respondents are as well. Most of the people that are testing it are excited about it. Parker, I know you have Warden of the First Tree in your cube, or at least you did, because it was playing it in your cube that made me re-add it to my cube after it was gone for, I don't know, like 3.5 years. Is this a card you're also looking at for your environment?
I am looking at it. It is another one of those aggro pieces that has, most of its power is in aggression, but then it also has some value that's orthogonal to aggression, which is the kind of Phyrexian arena trigger thing. And that's really neat because it gives the aggro player a decision tree that's branching, and it sometimes leads them away from pure aggression, which leads to a greater variety of game outcomes and, different decision trees for both players. So I really like that. On the other hand, a death touch counter just makes me cry inside. And
it's actually wild that this puts a death touch counter on it, but the activated abilities don't put any, exactly. Level up as an ability is very similar to this, but it has a level counter, which helps you remember what mode it's on. It's always been a pet peeve of mine about the Warden of the First Trees and the Figure of Destinies of the world that you just have to remember which step it's on because there's no counter to indicate it. And of all things, they have a counter just to indicate that it has Death Touch, which I guess is going to effectively serve as a counter for the fact that it's at the second level of its leveling, but it's definitely a strange combination of rules text in some ways.
Yeah, it's just a nightmare to remember which stage it's on. I mean, I don't know. You're right that the Death Touch counter does help as a mnemonic, and then when you put a 1/1 counter on it as well, it's on stage 3+ or whatever. I don't know. I think I will play it if I get my hands on one. I'm just aware of that slightly additional burden of complexity.
Yeah. You mentioned this was primarily an aggro card, and I think you're maybe right. But to me, the value I see in cards like this and like Knight of the Ebon Legion, for example, is that it has the possibility of being an aggro card if that's what you want at that moment. If you're in game 2 against your opponent that is a control deck with a couple board wipes, you can just play this on turn 1 and then just keep leveling it up and say, I'm going to make you answer this before this game continues, right? This is going to put a lot of pressure on you until you show me you can answer it. But it also has the opportunity to not be an aggro threat if you're in some sort of mirror or a situation where you don't want an aggro card. This is just kind of inevitability. I love that this card specifically, I think, will play really interestingly in a blue-black tempo or maybe even control deck where you can hold up counter spells, you can hold up removal spells, and if you don't have anything to do with that mana because your opponent didn't pose a threat that needed an answer, you just keep dumping your mana into your Evolved Sleeper, and it just takes over the game, draws cards. It's got a really... It's a really dynamic game piece, I think, that can fit into a lot of different kinds of decks, which, as one of our hot takes to test, is actually a downside for some people. This card is just a good card. It goes in every deck. It doesn't, push your draft in one direction or another. So it definitely depends on what you're looking for, but I like that aspect of this card that I feel like, even though it's a 1-drop, it's a 1-drop that you might run in your otherwise very controlling deck.
Bill's hot take.
Hey, Bill here with a hot take on Evolved Sleeper. Like most people, I think the card is very good. However, I find it to be quite boring. It doesn't have any synergies really with most other abilities, and the text box is quite large for something that's very boring. When I want something that goes in most decks, I want it to be simplistic but good.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we're saying the same thing from maybe different angles, Andy, because I agree with everything you said. Yeah.
Next up, we've got another black card. It's Cult Conscript. For 1 black mana, it's a 2/1 Skeleton Warrior. Cult Conscript enters the battlefield tapped, and it has an activated ability, 1 and a black, return Cult Conscript from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate this only if a non-skeleton creature died under your control this turn. So, just a flavorful way of saying, if something else died except for this Cult Conscript, you can put it back into play for 2 mana.
It didn't really strike me until just now. We've always talked about how cards that have some existing precedent, existing comparison point, always rank higher on our surveys, and every single one of these top 6 cards either compares directly to a very popular card in cubes or a whole class of card in cubes. And Cult Conscript is in the tradition of your Blood-Soaked Champions, your Grave Crawlers, the Skeleton one, the other Skeleton one, I can't remember the name of, that are these 1 mana 2 ones. Yeah, Gutter Bones, thank you, Parker. These 1 mana 2 ones that have some recursive ability and some combination of inability to block or enters the battlefield tapped and some terms under which they can be returned to the battlefield. I'm surprised to see this so high at 44% of our respondents, just because I didn't think that many people were playing black aggro in their cubes, I guess. I always read that as kind of an unpopular deck in a lot of cubes. So this is higher than I expected it. I did a bad job last week guessing what cards I thought would be at the top, and I'm kind of punching myself about the number 2 here. I could have definitely guessed number 2 if I had thought about it, but I never would have guessed Cult Conscript would have been number 3.
Yeah, and this is being tested by 43% of the people that responded, and with a rating of 2.4 out of 3, so both a lot of testers and a really high rating. I'm surprised as well, but I think maybe it's just that partly it could be due to the fact that we've just gotten a lot of similar cards like this recently, so this sort of like black aggro theme might just be a lot more viable these days.
Yeah, that is true. It could just be there's enough redundancy now that maybe before, if you just had Blood-Soaked Champion back when Khans of Tarkir was printed, you're like, well, this card's cool, but there's not enough for me to have a dedicated aggro black deck. And then now that you have that and Gutterbones and Cult Conscript and Gravecrawler and all these other cards, maybe you could just do it now.
Although, to be honest, and to your point, they do have a lot of these like weird, slightly different abilities, like some enter the battlefield tapped, some just can't block, some, have some other drawback to them, and I always get those mixed up just because it's like, well, is this tapped? Can I crew something? Oh, wait, no, this one just can't block. So I would almost say just like, if that's something you're interested in, you could run doubles of any of these cards or multiples.
Hey, the classic Jason approach of multiple Gravecrawlers. He's famous for doing multiple Gravecrawlers instead of Gravecrawlers at home of many varieties.
I think the other component of this card's popularity is that it is an uncommon, so therefore it is valid and legal for peasant curators.
That is true. Gravecrawler and Blood-Soaked Champion both rares. I believe Gutterbones was an uncommon, if I'm remembering correctly. Is that also a rare?
I think so.
No, all the prior versions have been rare.
Interesting. Yeah, that's actually a relevant point. So maybe this is the first time our peasant cubing friends get to access some of these recursive black threats.
If we can take a brief interlude, I think we should mention the most popular pauper legal card of Dominaria United, and that card is Tolarian Terror. 6 and a blue for a 5/5 creature serpent. However, it costs 1 less for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard, and it has Ward 2. And I think this is a really unique or uniquely well-suited control finisher for low rarity cubes, and even low power or budget cubes or things that are looking for particularly this kind of finisher, because the Ward 2 combined with the cost reduction means that you're often going to be paying only a few mana for this 5/5 finisher, and your opponent can deal with it, but they can't blow you out on mana. And that means that I think it's really balanced from both sides of the battlefield. So I think it's a really positive and healthy design in the control finisher space, and it's no surprise that it's the most popular peasant. No, I always get them confused. Pauper legal card on the set.
Yeah, I think this is a really potent payoff for any kind of spell slinging deck. I've seen plenty of people considering this card for the most powerful of Eternal environments, so certainly it will make a lot of sense in any Pauper cube that is trying to play powerful spells matter payoffs. I even saw Aspiring Spike again, and Aspiring Spike, God bless him for testing all the new cards in Modern whenever he gets a chance, but I saw him trying Tolarian Terror as a swap for Murktide Regent in a deck that specifically cared about keeping their graveyard full of spells and not delving them away for other reasons. And, I don't think that was particularly successful, and I don't think this card really compares to Murktide Regent on raw power level, but the fact that was even a thing that he felt was reasonable to do speaks to the potential power of this card. It's potentially a 1-mana 5/5 Ward 2, which is a lot of stats. We'd be remiss not to mention that it is actually tied with Urborg Repossession for the most popular Pauper legal card. And that's that sorcery that can buy back 1 or 2 things from your graveyard, depending if you kick it for green mana. that card I think is going to be really potent in Pauper environments, which I often find come down to value rather than tempo, and a 2-for-1 in your Golgari deck that's going to be really, I think, quite scary in a lot of Pauper environments.
Sure. So we'll jump back to the top cards of this set by popularity. And that brings us to the number 2 most popular card of Dominaria United. It's Aether Channeler, 2 and a blue, creature, human wizard. When it enters the battlefield, choose 1. Either create a 1/1 bird with flying, return another target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, or draw a card. And it's a 2/1. It's being tested by just over half of our respondents with the top rating of the set, 2.6 on average. And it is a card that Andy completely forgot when making predictions for these rankings.
This is the one that I'm kicking myself over because I absolutely could have guessed this card. This card has Cube designers are going to love me written all over it because it references so many cards people have loved in the past and introduces this modality to an otherwise kind of iconic effect. These blue 3-drops that can either draw a card or bounce a thing, and now also make a bird creature token. Pure power level perspective, what do you think of this card, Parker? How do you think this compares to Llanowar or compares to Cloudkin Seer or any of these other kind of value-oriented blue 3-drops?
I don't know. My preferred comparison is actually Teferi Time Raveler. You know, you're on record, Andy, as saying it's your favorite bounce spell.
I love it. It's a really good bounce spell. Hot take.
Yeah, and I think this is probably a similar design space here. I don't know. I think the main mode is probably the bounce. It can see play in control decks, in aggressive decks, in mid-range decks. Those will appreciate the flexibility here. So I do think it's strong. In fact, I'll even say that I think it's the second best or first best bounce affecting cube, depending on how you feel about Teferi's static ability. That said, I don't particularly like it. I'm not one of those players with a sense of nostalgia for Llanowar, the original ETB bounce a creature. And in fact, I was reading Dom Harvey's Cube blog the other day. He writes on Riptide Lab, and he's also appeared on the show very recently. And Dom said something that I really liked, which is people who are still playing Llanowar in 2022 are probably not interested in making gradual improvements to its power level. There's probably something going on there that has to do directly with Llanowar history or nostalgia or some other factor. And so
it's excellent creature type.
I was just
for
saying,
example.
Anthony continuing to play it just because it's a jellyfish.
Yeah. And so I don't want to say it's a strict upgrade to Llanowar, because the people who are on Llanowar aren't playing it because it's the best Llanowar these days.
My original impression of this card, and I think I even said on the last episode that I think it's only very marginally better than Llanowar. I think I'm going to revise that a little bit to say it's marginally better than Cloudkin Seer, I think. And both of those, I think, are noticeably better than Llanowar. I actually think the main mode on this in a lot of environments is going to be just draw a card. I like that it does have an option for tempo. If I am beating you down and I just want to bounce your thing and get in for more damage, and I don't care about the fact that that's, not a 2-for-1, then I can just bounce a thing to your hand. But I think if you're playing the value game and you're planning on trading with an aggro threat with this thing and having it just die in combat and you just want to draw a card to keep the cards flowing, I like that modality. But overall, I don't think it's actually much better than a Cloudkin Seer. And honestly, even in some situations, Cloudkin Seer's flying is going to put it over the top, even though it doesn't have the other modes available to it. So I think people are perhaps overly enthusiastic about how good this is going to be in their environments because it does scratch so many itches that we know cube designers have. I would definitely expect it when we, fast forward to the retrospective of this set that we are not going to see 50% of our testers still on Aether Channeler. But that's, of course, not necessarily a criticism of the card. I mean, cubes just naturally have churn. And I feel like this card, I think I said either on the Discord or maybe Twitter that I feel like it has a little bit of Charming Prince-itis. Charming Prince is not a card I am particularly fond of. It's 2 mana, it's a 2/2, it's modal. It's got, a lot of things to recommend it. But at the end of the day, it's do I really want a unexciting menu kind of modal card? Anthony, you've been critical of the menu style modal cards without any real flavor to why you have different modes. It just pick a thing, it does the thing differently. And I think this is kind of in that space for me. I'm not excited about it, but I also am nowhere near putting Llanowar in my cube. So I'm not really the audience for this card, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree agree with you, I think, on power level, just because I think that modality is extremely relevant. And, if you just think about, well, how often do you want to bounce a thing? Fairly often, but when you don't, being able to either draw a card or just add more bodies to have more blockers, or maybe you're actually getting in for damage, or you have some sort of blink synergy, and you're actually just turning this into a threat on its own by bouncing it a couple times and making a bunch of birds. I think that modality is extremely powerful. I'm personally not interested in it for a lot of the reasons you just mentioned, but I think that for a lot of cube designers, that is going to have lasting appeal.
The bird mode is the one that is the biggest wild card to me. I'm not sure how often you're going to want to make a bird or how good that's going to be in different contexts. Like, even if my opponent is beating me down with 1 toughness aggro creatures, I'm not sure I just don't want to draw a card instead of getting 2 creatures for my 3 mana and just draw another land to keep my deck churning and not get stuck.
Why would I make another blocker to destroy my opponent's creatures when I could draw cards and maybe I would draw a removal spell?
It could be anything. It could even be another blocker. Yeah, I don't know. I understand why it's a popular card. I think on paper, the modality is really exciting. This is the kind of card I would be excited to put in my battle box if I was still maintaining that, I think, for all the reasons that we mentioned, is the fact that it's modal, gives you these choices. It can kind of play differently in different game states. But ultimately, I think for my own cube, it doesn't fit into any kind of blue deck that I'm trying to encourage in my environment, and ultimately it's just kind of a little underwhelming on every mode for me, that it kind of like Terra Asunder doesn't make up for its inefficiency with modality for me, I think.
Train Master GT's hot take.
I think Aether Channeler is going to be the single most overrated card in Dominaria United. Mana War variants have started to show their age in higher power environments, as threats have started to cost less mana and enter the battlefield with more value. Even expensive threats tend not to be completely blanked by being bounced back to hand like they kind of used to in the old days. I don't think the extra modes on Aether Channeler actually make up for the fact that it's kind of inefficient at its most likely primary mode, which is going to be bouncing. I really don't want to be paying 3 mana to make a 2-1 and draw a card, or make a 2-1 and a 1-1 flyer, at least in formats that bear resemblance to 2020s era constructed formats. Having said that, I do think this card looks very exciting for low power environments that are sort of around the power level of the Masters set in limited format. If I were building a lower power cube or battle box, I would be looking at this with great interest. But for a higher power format like mine, I'm going to make like John Lennon and let it be.
That brings us to the number 1 most popular card from Dominaria United. The card that I thought for sure would not be the number 1 most popular card. It is, of course, Cut Down. 1 black mana for an instant. Destroy target creature with total power and toughness 5 or less. Tested by 57% of our respondents with a rank of 2.5. More people are excited about this cheap little removal spell than I anticipated.
Turns out it's not only your favorite card, it is almost 60% of
everybody's favorite card.
Yeah, 60% of everybody's favorite card.
I wonder how many of those people that are enthusiastic about putting Cut Down in their cubes have Disfigure in their cubes and like it. I think maybe this is exciting because it's like new and shiny. And I mean, to be fair, it does have cooler art than Disfigure and a cooler name. So I understand all those factors too. But I'm just surprised because I feel like those kinds of small scale removal spells that are cheap but can only target smaller stuff tend to not be as popular in Cube as... Well, people tend to not like them as much as I like them, I guess, is the best way to put it. And unless the card ends up being really popular and constructed, a la Fatal Push, you tend to see him skipped over oftentimes in Cube environments. But here it is, number 1, Cut Down. And I'm glad to see it, I guess. I think the card's fantastic. I think it goes in any number of Cube environments. So in some ways, it makes sense that it's up here. And maybe I don't have a good grasp on who all the Cube designers are out there.
Yeah, that seems likely. I was trying to think of a way to drag you because, as you know, I've already written the podcast blurb, and it says Parker and Anthony drag Andy on air.
Yeah, got to do it.
But I couldn't think of a good insult, and all the previous times I've tried to insult you, it's just sounded mean. So, I repent of those.
This is your problem, Parker. You're just fundamentally a kind and nice person. It's hard to drag people for entertainment effect when you're so kind.
Yeah, maybe next time you drag me on air, and I'll cry afterwards, but it'll be good radio. Yeah, I like Cut Down. I think the art is completely awesome. Dominic Mayer is just on fire lately. Every card that they have drawn or produced is just amazing. This is no exception, and it's a real clean design. It's as cheap as can be, and I'm very pumped to play it.
Now, I was going to ask you, because you're Captain Watchwolf, This don't kill a Watchwolf. Are you still as high on this in your environment, given that you have... Well, it does kill a Curd Ape, I guess. That is kind of relevant. You do have as many Curd Apes as you have Watchwolves. But you're still excited about this, even in an environment with a lot of 2-mana 3/3s?
Yes, that is correct. So you're right, it doesn't hit a Watchwolf, but it does hit 118 cards in my cube. And I have that number so easily come to mind because in our article for Dominaria United, we've included a search syntax so that you too, listener, can search your cube and filter it for the things that cut down will hit. So that's, a respectable amount of the creatures in my cube do get murdered by cut down. And so, yeah, it's totally serviceable for me.
And I guess maybe I'll revise what I said earlier. Maybe my perceptions are not so far off because while 57% is a high number, if we're comparing it to like Consider, which I believe had a 96% testing rate amongst our respondents, this is still only a little over half of all the cube designers that are playing this. I would guess if I was the designer of all of the cubes that submitted it, I would put it in a lot more than 57% of those responses. So maybe I am still higher on it, and just the fact that it's the most popular here doesn't change the fact that 60% high, but we're not talking about Usher of the Fallen. What is the card?
Usher of the Fallen, yeah. It was tested by like over 70% of the respondents to Kaldheim.
Yeah, so we're not talking about Usher of the Fallen or Consider numbers. It's high, but it's not through the roof, which I would argue maybe it should be. So I'm going to go on record. Even though it's the number one card, more of you should be playing Cut Down than are.
I'll co-sign that, yeah.
I think everyone should play whatever they want.
Shut up, nerd.
I think everyone
drag Anthony on air.
On the topic of great illustrations, everyone should be playing more Bone Splinters with their cult conscripts that they're so excited about. And I think if you get to sacrifice your cult conscripts to your Bone Splinters, you should get a special achievement because those two illustrations are sick together.
That art is sick. I love that.
What is the Triangle of Light in Cut Down? Do we know? Is it a window? Does Joda...
Maybe it's Joda's portal or something that
who knows?
Teleports people through.
Maybe it's just a cool shape. That's also fine. I'm not picky, as long as it looks good. And this card does look good. I think that's it for our Dominaria United Cube Community set review. I think it's a very deep set for cubes. Like I mentioned, there's a very... I'm going to say it. I'm going to say long tail.
Don't say it.
I got to
figure
out...
Say it.
Well, it's like the curve, the line of testing
we're talking
of cards.
About this rank frequency distribution.
Sure, the rank frequency distribution. It's there's a lot of cards that are being tested by 10 or more % of our respondents. Like it looks like 30-ish cards. So just a lot of cards here are interesting to a lot of people. And I think the fact that these mechanics are generally pretty flexible. Dominaria is inoffensive and generic context where some people, for example, won't play a funky car from Kaladesh if they don't want to put a cool car or helicopter in their cube. None of these cards I think are going to be off flavor for anyone's environment. And they're also callbacks to iconic Magic cards from Invasion or otherwise. I think there's a lot to love here in this set. And so, yeah, I think this is a deep file that people are maybe going to keep coming back to and keep finding more exciting cards for.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I've already, gushed about Terra Asunder, and I feel the same way about domain designs, which encourage slight splashes in some cases. I think the play patterns and the design intent of this set, the games that these game objects will lead to, are all really fun, unique, and generally just really interesting decisions are going to be generated by these game pieces.
Well, that's it. Thanks, everybody, for their survey responses. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for sending us your voice memo hot takes. We couldn't make this show without you, and I hope you love listening to it as much as we love making it. It's always fun to get everyone's positions on these cards and kind of see where the whole community is at when a new set comes out.
And it's so we do have all these results on the website now, so be sure to go check out the article, which will be linked on the homepage. You can see the cool graph and ranked list. And I think it's especially exciting as we're getting more and more responses to these surveys. Every new set, we get a few more people, that it's not just the couple top cards that come out, but there's a lot more detail in that middle section as well. So definitely do go check that out. And thank you all listeners for submitting to this survey.
I think we're going to have to do a whole survey for Warhammer 40k. Some of these cards in these commander decks, I think they really just like put a lot of design resources into those commander decks. I'm seeing like very inventive, exciting cards that I love. I almost never look at the commander decks, frankly, and see cards that I love. But even if not that many are going to go in my cubes, I'm looking at stuff and just being like, wow, what a novel, exciting, cool design. Like, I find myself a little bit blown away with the new design space they're showing off in this set, where it's like, oh yeah, they could just keep making cool Magic cards. They have not hit the bottom of that well yet. So we're definitely going to have to talk about that set in some capacity. So stay tuned for that.
It's going to be a lot of new cards. It's at least 130 so far.
Yeah, I'm not even sure when it's entirely going to be spoiled, but there will be a survey up for that, so if you're testing any of those cards, keep your eye out for it, and we'll be talking about it on the show. I'm not sure if we'll do a whole perspective article. It probably will, maybe a little bit shorter than the past. We'll figure it out. The set seems pretty interesting and pretty exciting, and definitely is going to be an all-star among players with multiplayer cubes, I imagine. All right, and that's it. Thank you for tuning in. All of our music for the show is produced by DJ James Nasty. All of the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony, Parker, and I, thinking very hard about Magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. Thank you, Anthony and Parker, for doing that.
My pleasure. And I'm sorry that I tried to drag you.
Parker, I don't know what it is. There's something about me that people just love to drag. I think it's maybe that people can tell I can take it.
You're just really confident kind of guy. Yeah, it doesn't seem like you're going to go home and cry after,
right.
like
People look at me and are like, I'm not going to ruin this man by making fun of him. I just seem like I can which, I mean, it's true. I can take it. I grew up in a family where there was a lot of playful and non-playful ribbing.
Verbal abuse.
Yeah, so I can in fact take it. Maybe people have correctly picked up on that, but yeah, you can make fun of me whenever you want. I know it comes from a place of love.
I'll try.
All right, we'll try it on for size next time. Try being a real dick on. See how it fits for you.
Okay, yeah.